this gap in the way we discuss racism, in particular in a German context, where for a long time the object of racism was not just people of color, but in fact people who we would by today's standard consider white, namely people from Eastern Europe.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello and welcome to today's Transformative Podcast. I'm Jannis Panagiotidis, Scientific Director of RECET, and today I kind of play a dual role in this podcast as host on the one hand, but also as guest to some extent, because today we're going to discuss a book that I co-authored together with my colleague and friend Hans-Christian Petersen from Oldenburg, who is with me today, and we will talk about our book entitled Anti-East European Racism in Germany. This book is soon to be published with Belz Publishers in German. We're hoping before an English translation at some point, definitely. But today we're going to discuss in English some of the key points of this book, some of the key arguments and its overall relevance. So Hans, happy that you're with us today. Why did we write this book? Maybe if we start with this very basic question, why did we feel the need for this particular work of history?
Because it was overdue. This would be the short answer. A little bit longer. There's an astonishing gap, I would say, between the historical importance of the topic, especially in German history until 1945, and the point that it's rather a blind spot in research concerning racism, racist history, and anti-racist debates as well. So this was our main motivation.
Indeed, one could say that this book came out of some public debate of the present, more than actual historiographical debates, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and the new relevance of racism as a topic and of anti-racism. And this blind spot that you mentioned, this gap in the way we discuss racism, in particular in a German context, where for a long time the object of racism was not just people of color, but in fact people who we would by today's standard consider white, namely people from Eastern Europe. So if we talk a bit about the historical dimension of this, the deep history of this, and how far can we really trace the history of anti-East European racism or of racial stereotyping of Eastern Europeans or the region of Eastern Europe?
If we talk about stereotypes, we could go back to the 16th, 17th century, dealing with reports, journeys from people reporting about the journey through the Russian Empire, the emerging Russian Empire, Olearios and others. But our main starting point in the book is the period of the Enlightenment, because if you read the text of the protagonists of the Enlightenment, not only the German ones, but also the German ones, Kant, Hegel, Herder, and others, it's astonishing that you almost everywhere find this, I would say, colonial picture of western part of Europe, which is civilized with a high culture, and the eastern part of Europe, which is still a part of Europe. It's not outside of Europe, but it's Europe, but not Europe, as Larry Wolff put it, characterized by backwardness, barbarism, and things like this. And that this is a colonial picture, I would say. We can take this as a starting point. And then if we look further through the 19th century, we can see that the specific view of the East is something which is very present in Germany's long 19th century. One example are the debates in the Paulskirche, a very prominent memory place in the German historical memory, where we have a wide cross-fractional majority, starting with the discussion of the future place of Poznan and Bohemia in a future German empire. But then they talk about a much wider so-called German East, is a wide space which reaches to the shores of the Black Sea, which is characterized as backward, as uncivilized, and which has to be civilized in mission civilisatrice. And then if we go further, I mean, these are only spotlights, of course, but it's not only in the debates of the Paulskirche. You have bestsellers like Soll and Haben from Gustav Freytag, which was on the bookshelves of almost every upper bourgeois household for decades, which has very prominent, on the one hand, anti-Semitic topics in it, and on the other hand, this anti-Polish stereotype of the so-called Polnische Wirtschaft, Polish economy. And then at the end of the 19th century, we have a process of radicalization and racialization. One could quote Max Weber, one could look at the state policies, the migration regimes, where we have restrictions concerning naturalization. We have forced expulsion of Polish people, of Jewish people from the annexed Polish territories of Prussia, things like this. And then it goes on with the radicalization in the 20th century.
When you sketch this broad historical horizon, it's kind of remarkable that a lot of this is well known. I mean, we did not reinvent the wheel at this particular point, but it's remarkable that there have been few attempts at synthesizing this history into sort of a bigger picture of Germany's relation to its eastern neighbors, in particular in these colonial terms, which of course provide sort of a conceptual link to the whole issue of race and racism, and to the answer why we would consider the treatment of people who are still Europeans, even if sort of lesser Europeans in the imagination, but still Europeans, why we would still speak of racialization. So this colonial relation has a lot to do with this. It's also remarkable that a lot of the literature that exists on this topic has not been really received in Germany. You mentioned Larry Wolff, whose book Inventing Eastern Europe, of course, had a huge impact also on historical scholarship in Germany, but has never been translated to German, for instance, unlike Maria Todorova's Invention of the Balkans. And the literature on German colonialism in the East has until recently mainly been an American affair as well. You could think of Christian Kopp's work on colonial discourses on Poland and literature. So there's really a gap between English language and German language literature, which is high time was closed. If we think about the 20th century, and I mean, that's, I think, the focal point of our argument for racialization. So why one can speak of racism against East Europeans is, of course, National Socialism and the way Eastern Europe was treated by the Nazis, which is well known that, again, it's not news per se that the East was treated differently than the West. There was a war of annihilation in the East. But it's remarkable how little impact this has had on historical memory in Germany. And what do you think? Why is that? I mean, why haven't we talked about this in German memory culture in terms of, what scholars have recently called Erinnerungsverantwortung, responsibility arising from a particular memory, the way Eastern Europe and Eastern Europeans have been treated by Germans?
It's a good question. I would say at least 2 points as an answer. The one point is that I think Eastern Europe, if we take this very vague term, Eastern Europe is still rather badly known in the German public in the schools. If you look at the curricula, European history is still very Western European history. This is the one point. And if people don't know much about Eastern European history, Eastern European present, they also don't know much about the topic we are talking about. Maybe this is one explanation. The other is the point you mentioned. We have, on the one hand, in the Second World War, we have the war of annihilation in the Soviet Union in Southeastern Europe, in Poland and so on, which means that we are talking about millions of German families, the soldiers taking part in this war, which doesn't mean that every soldier has committed war crimes, but they all were part of the Wehrmacht, which was part of this war of annihilation, which couldn't have taken place as it did without the Wehrmacht. And on the other hand, we have the forced laborers, the Ostarbeiter, in the German Reich, which were also very present on thousands of in German agriculture, in shops, factories, and so on. So if we talk about this, you have a far wider reaching responsibility or involvement, let's say involvement of huge parts of the German post-Nazi society than when we just only talk about the SS, for example. Talking about the Wehrmacht and the Ostarbeiter means talking about the German society as a whole. It took until the end of the 1990s with the so-called Wehrmachtsausstellung, when this point got attention, and still it was something like a scandal in the end of the 1990s, although it was, from the point of research, it was nothing new. Maybe this is another explanation.
The 1990s were indeed a crucial period for the rediscovery of some of these issues, right? So there was the Wehrmachtsausstellung, so this exhibition organized by the Hamburg Institute for Social Research on crimes of the Wehrmacht. There was also a renewed discussion on the forced laborers because of the issue of compensation that arose after the end of communism. But of course, again, the astonishing and remarkable thing is that, as you mentioned, there were millions of Germans implicated in the crimes, but also, even, as you said, even if they weren't war criminals themselves, they were exposed to Eastern Europe and the way East Europeans were treated, both at the front and back home with the forced laborers. So it was really a mass experience, and it's kind of remarkable that nobody has really looked into the way this experience lived on after 1945. It almost seems like there's a 0 hour still in historiography. There have been some attempts recently, I think, sort of looking beyond this caesura. If you think of Maria Alexopoulos' book, for instance, on the construction of foreigners in the German imagination and the crucial role that these former forced laborers who then became DPs in Germany played as sort of the first foreigners after the war, who were still very much discussed in racial terms. But then both in her book and in historiography in general, this kind of fades from sight, and we don't really know much about the way these experiences lingered on. We do know something about the way scholarship remained influenced by certain paradigms of Eastern Europe, which is used to be, or is one of your specializations. So the history of Ostforschung, research on the East. And many of these scholars from before 1945 continued their careers in the Federal Republic. So maybe you can give us a sense of what we write in this book about these continuities post-45 in this particular field, for instance, the example of scholarship.
Yeah, there is a lot of continuity. I mean, you have a new frame, you have the Cold War, anti-communism, but this is also nothing new, that this is a frame where many things could be continued without mentioning race as a key term, but maybe culture or the empire of evil or whatever, but some images and also hierarchizations of the East and the West could easily be continued in this Cold War era. And this is also true for the scientific field, and it took until, I would say, the 1960s, 70s. Yeah, these old traditions were criticized, new people. It's also a question of generations getting to the professorships and so on. There was evolving something new, which was not so hierarchized anymore, dealing with Eastern Europe or Eastern European history. But then we are talking about the 1970s. And other things. I mean, this is one of the key points of our book in general. Are we still talking about racism? Till today, when we are talking about anti-Eastern European attitudes in the German society or not? If you define racism, we follow the definition by Philomena Asset. She's speaking of hierarchies of worthiness, meaning that people are hierarchized because of biological or cultural essentialist markers. And then, as a consequence, they are excluded from materials or immaterials resources. If we take this definition, and this is something rather common, I guess, in the research dealing with the history of racism, then I guess there are relevant points why we should think about also framing this history as racist. Not all of it, maybe for some fields it's better to speak about discrimination or exclusion, but looking at this big historical importance until 1945 and the continuities after 1945, at least we should not exclude thinking about anti-East European or anti-Slavic racism.
And it is a question we get a lot, right? And that we're grappling with if it's justified to speak of racism. And of course, there are different arguments to be made. I think one important argument that's also at stake here has to do with fear of the other, which is also a constitutive element of racist or racialized thinking. And that really becomes visible in different ways after 1945. So on the one hand, this translation of fear of the East into a fear of communism, which already coexisted before 1945 and after 1945 was sort of easily translated into sort of politically correct way of being afraid of the East, of the communist East. But even when communism disappeared, the fear did not go away, or the fear changed and then came back as a fear of immigration, which was very typical for the late 19th and early 20th century. You mentioned the migration restrictions from these periods before. And if you look at the late 80s, early 90s, and the scenarios that were developed in some of the media, but also scholarly discourse about, and political discourse about 10 million, 20 million, maybe 50 million people who might emigrate from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and sort of flood the West, it's quite clear that there is a massive fear that is rooted in a long-standing historical imagination, which has to do a lot with racialized preconceptions of East Europeans, even if those were not usually articulated anymore in the language of race. But that's, of course, something we know from Balibar and others about racism without race. The concept of race, especially in a German context, became kind of a non-category. You cannot speak of Rasse anymore. At any rate, there's still a lot of open questions, I think. So our book does not pretend to answer all the questions as yet. For example, we don't have much on the GDR, which was perhaps the German post-45 state that had the most continuous exposure to East Europeans and the most intense interactions, actually, for most of the time. So we don't have much on that. We do have chapters on the labor market, which is really one of the sites where discrimination, whether you want to call it racial or not, of East Europeans is a reality. We have a chapter on literature and the way young immigrants, especially second-generation immigrants or people who came to Germany as teenagers, articulate their experiences with German society, sometimes explicitly in a language of race. Given this still incomplete picture and these many open questions, what would be the next steps to take here in this evolving field of research?
Going on with the discussion, I think the book is meant as a beginning of a discussion and as a first scientific study. I would be glad if there would be more recognition. You mentioned this chapter on autobiographical literature, which is really got more in the last years, which is also an interesting process. And our last chapter is on online activism by young post-East activists being visible and audible on Instagram via podcasts and other media, and which explicitly talk about their experiences here in Germany in the 1990s, in the 2000s and after that. There's something growing. There's some wish to be heard, to be recognized. And this would be a first step, because one point that many of these people miss is recognition, I guess. And after the recognition, then we can start a debate how we can frame this. Are we talking about racism? Are we talking about discrimination and so on? If all this would take place with a wider recognition of Eastern Europe as a very central part of German history and present in this field, then I would be glad.
Hans, thanks for this discussion today. Thanks everybody for listening today, and tune in for our next episode of the Transformative Podcast.